Lords and ladies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, good afternoon and a very warm welcome. My name is Mohammed Hinaydi. It is an honor to have you here with us for today's event hosted by the Extremist Monitoring Analysis Network, the acronym of which is EMAN, otherwise known as Faith in Arabic. This afternoon we are joined by prominent experts and public speakers who will be discussing a multitude of issues with respect to the current national security landscape in the United Kingdom. These issues include Islamist extremism, the rising threat of the far right, militancy, radicalism, and global threats to Britain. Before we begin, I would like to introduce myself and my organization, the EMAN Network. EMAN's objective is to address the rising threat of extremism, radicalism, fanaticism, and intolerance. These isms are primarily fueled by hate speech. We all have different definitions of hate speech, but hate speech, I believe, is a conveyor belt, and it leads to radicalism. Radicalism, in turn, leads to militancy, and in the worst cases, militancy can lead to genocide. So hate speech begins when certain individuals and organizations, be they a religious group or an ethnic group, believe that they are collectively superior to other ethnicities or other religions or other peoples. It is the epitome of the us versus them mentality. I founded EMAN because I truly believe that those on the fringes of society have been on the winning side for far too long. They represent a very, very tiny, minute population or portion of society. When it comes to Islamists, for instance, and I've said this quite often, the same people who hijacked those planes 2 decades ago on September 11 are the same people or belong to the same ideology that has hijacked a religion that is 1,500 years old, which has approximately 1.8 billion adherents. As a practicing Muslim, I feel very strongly about this, and I know that I'm joined by hundreds of millions, if not billions, of Muslims around the world. As I look around the room today, I would like to think of us all as good men and good women. And as we are all familiar with this famous quote, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for us all to do nothing. I am proud that in less than a year after its founding, EMAN has one of the world's largest free-to-access databases of hate preachers of various faiths and ideologies. These include Islamist extremists of all different shapes and forms, white supremacists, neo-Nazis, Christian fundamentalists, Jewish extremists, and Hindutva nationalists. All of these people are a very tiny portion of their respective global populations, yet they do have some impact, some more than others, on the way people view these certain religions or ideologies. In total, currently, we have over 150 individuals and organizations on our databases, and we are only just starting. There's plenty more. We are factual, we are politically neutral, and we are ideologically neutral. We are aware that these people exist everywhere, in every religion, every geography, and every ideology. Their sole purpose is to foster intolerance, fan the flames of hatred, and sow division within societies and people. The actions of these people prevent peace amongst nations. They prevent peace among religions. They prevent peace in societies and countries, in the Western world, and in the Eastern world, and everywhere else, and in the Middle East, which I like to call West Asia. This is how our database looks. You can filter based on faith, affiliation, and type. Beyond hate preachers, EMAN relies on an in-house network of experts spanning the globe with years of experience. These experts focus on particular geographies, whether it's North Africa, West Asia, the Arabian Peninsula, South Asia, Southeast Asia, or the Western world. These experts possess a sound understanding of the geopolitical and socio-religious factors in certain regions. In today's world, this insight is particularly important as extremist organizations play a large role in certain regions. Their footprint is, in some areas across the world, a lot bigger than the footprint of the countries that they operate in. This is why we publish commentary and analysis on certain events that are at the nexus of these geopolitical and socio-religious developments. Today we are seeing sights on television that we have never seen before. We are seeing armed far-right and far-left groups patrol the streets of US cities, brandishing assault rifles that only US Special Forces use. Today we are seeing Al-Qaeda-affiliated organizations control entire provinces in Syria. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the Al-Qaeda successor, which consists of 7 armed extremist Islamist groups, controls Idlib province, and 3.5 million people, one of the biggest provinces in all of Syria. In Yemen, we have the Houthis, an armed Islamist group as well, that people have now forgotten about. It controls more than 65% of the country's population. And last, but definitely not least, we saw Afghanistan this year fall to a non-state actor, the Taliban, another armed extremist organization, who we've been all fighting for the past 20 years. Western countries, Arab countries, Muslim countries, and everyone else. What you can see on the screen here is an example of some of these individuals that we have in our databases. We have picked 3 extremists just to demonstrate that, to demonstrate what we have. These extremists are all based in the United Kingdom. Saeed al-Ghamdi is a Saudi extremist. He's wanted in the kingdom on terror charges. We all know that Saudi Arabia has had a history in the past of radicalism within certain elements of its society and its clergy. This gentleman has said that Saudi Arabia is pursuing a policy of purifying its curriculum to make it more tolerant, more liberal, and to be accepting of other individuals and other religions. At the very end, he says, as if that's something that's bad, he says, soon Saudi Arabia will teach secularism, liberalism, and maybe Judaism. This man resides in the United Kingdom. He's basically been banished from Saudi Arabia and he's living here in exile. This person should not be able to say these things. He should not be living here. Abu Halim is someone who's been arrested recently in May 2021 here in the UK as well. He was a recruiter for Daesh, for ISIS. He's also been very vocally critical of clerics, Muslim clerics across the world that are considered moderate and liberal, ones in Australia, which is where I'm from. Abu Halima was arrested on drug charges, very Islamic, very pious. He was sentenced to 4 years in jail. The reason behind the sentence has nothing to do with drugs. He was commemorating the 17th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks in 2018, spreading terrorist propaganda. Katie Hopkins, a far-right personality in the UK. Katie, as many of you know, has said some outrageous stuff about Islam and Muslims. After the Nice attacks, a horrific terrorist attack in France, she said that Islam disgusts me. She has a large following, and also, although now her social media has been shut down, it's that sort of rhetoric that is really divisive. It's not just Muslims she's after as well. She was slammed by the Alzheimer's Society for disgraceful tweets where she labeled dementia sufferers as bed blockers and that they should be put to death. That is basically euthanasia. What this lady what she said in 2015 is what the Nazis practiced around 80 years ago. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to now introduce our speakers for today's event. We only have one, I promise you, not multiple ones. Julia Ebner from the University of Oxford joins us today to discuss the current state of white supremacism. Dr. Ebner has written books covering right-wing extremism and Islamism, including her latest book, Going Dark, The Secret Social Lives of Extremists. Nick Timothy, previously a policymaker at the Home Office, a former chief of staff at 10 Downing Street, is now a popular columnist at the Daily Telegraph and author of Remaking One Nation. Ed Husain joins us today. He's a professor at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., has written multiple books on the threats of Islamist extremism in the UK, including his most recent book, Among the Mosques. Finally, Tom Tugendhat MP, our keynote speaker, will be discussing the global threats and challenges to Britain. Tom is chairman of the influential Foreign Affairs Committee in the House of Commons. His analysis of Western policy failures in Afghanistan made global headlines last month. We are delighted today and honored to bring you a stellar panel of speakers. Upon conclusion of Tom's final address, we will open the floor to a discussion and a Q&A session amongst us all. Thank you, and I would like to now invite Julia.
Is this one working? Yes, perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm not offended, by the way, if you start eating. I will focus on different trends that we're currently seeing on the white supremacist side of the spectrum, or on the far right end side of the spectrum. I do think this will be a very interesting discussion, as we have really different areas of expertise represented on the panel. So, as was briefly mentioned in the introduction, in Mohammed's introduction, I wrote the book Going Dark, The Secret Social Lives of Extremists, for which I went undercover with different extremist groups, and most of them were on the far right side of the spectrum. I also went undercover with jihadists, and with misogynist groups and conspiracy theory groups, which of course have a big overlap with far right extremists and white supremacists. What was interesting in these investigations that I did, so I was basically building up different fake identities online but also offline, and was recruited into their networks, but I could really find that there was a common pattern across all these different extremist groups. They were all going from recruitment to socialization. Socialization was really the most important step in the radicalization process. I would say even more important than the ideological indoctrination was this process of becoming a part of an exclusive subculture or of an exclusive community. And that was the case for all the extremist groups. And then there were communication campaigns and networking campaigns that were launched to network with like-minded individuals across the world. And of course, then sometimes this also ended in attacks. So there were these different stages in the radicalization process that I could spot. And now in the last just couple of years, we've of course seen that there has been a bit of a change in the landscape of extremism. And I want to briefly just give an overview of what my observations were in those last 2 coronavirus years, and then go to some of the trends that I would predict based on that, and based on my research. Hope Not Hate did a study and showed that there are actually 1 in 4 Britons currently that believe in QAnon-linked conspiracy theories. QAnon, for those who don't yet know it, is probably right now the worldwide biggest conspiracy theory community. They believe that basically all the people in Buckingham Palace are reptiles. I've just spoken to a QAnon sympathizer a couple of weeks ago on Parliament Square who told me that all the vaccinated people, have turned into hybrids. So we're half humans, half reptiles. And of course there are a lot of dimensions that add white supremacist ideologies to these conspiracy theories, because they would then blame, for example, the global Jewish elites for all of that. They would say, actually, it's them who started coronavirus, and they called it the plandemic. So we've really seen also a tsunami of hate. This is, in the words of the United Nations, they called it a tsunami of hate. And this has also shown, or been shown in various studies, for example, by the CST, that showed that there was a really stark rise in anti-Semitism online, and also in terms of the offline incidents that were reported. Online recruitment has also really surged in the course of the pandemic. we saw white supremacists really trying to tap into the new grievances, into the feelings of uncertainty, and recruit from new audiences. I will show you a few examples of that in a second. This is QAnon. You could see some of their banners at the latest anti-corona, anti-vaccination protests that were also taking place in London. I actually just went to one of the protests, of course under a fake identity, to speak to some of the people there 2 weeks ago in London. There was the Unite for Freedom rally. And you could see that there were completely normal people like you and me, basically, who have children who were afraid that their children would get vaccinated. You could see that's a legitimate debate. But there were also skinheads there. There were really, conspiracy theorists that are part of the QAnon movement. So unfortunately, there's a really strange new coalition that's forming here that I would say is one of the biggest dangers of the future for radicalization of also the mainstream and of really the masses. This has manifested itself in several types of hate attacks and also vandalism. We've seen, of course, linked to the QAnon conspiracy theory that phone masts were attacked because they think that the 5G network is why we have corona symptoms, or some of them believe that. But then also we've had attacks on minority communities, on migrants, because some of the white nationalist movements have blamed Muslim migrants for importing coronavirus. Some of them have blamed Jewish communities, so there were lots of anti-Semitic attacks, and some of them have blamed Chinese or Asian minority communities. Journalists have been attacked, in particular in Germany. There were lots of cases where journalists have become the target of this anger. And and of course, we've also seen attacks launched on our democratic institutions, on the Reichstag, the parliament building in Germany, but also on the Capitol in the US, in Washington, D.C., which you can see here on the left side on the bottom. I already briefly mentioned it. There has been a global rise of anti-Semitism, and there are lots of different narratives that are linked to that. One of them is that the pandemic that's basically putting the idea that the Jewish global elites have planned this coronavirus pandemic, putting that into the bigger QAnon conspiracy theory and saying that actually they are responsible, they want to benefit from the crisis financially or politically, and some of them even call it the Jew flu. So they would say that it's being spread more by the Jewish community. So there are lots of layers of anti-Semitism that can be found, in particular now in times of COVID, that are linked to these coronavirus conspiracy theories. And there have also been attempts to weaponize COVID against Jewish targets. For example, to put salvia on the handles of synagogues or of other religious institutions, including also, for example, refugee camps, but also other religious institutions like mosques, or depending on who their enemy is. But there were really attempts to weaponize the coronavirus against minorities. The first trend, coming to the trends now, is that we're really observing that there are many more international connections. That's, of course, been facilitated by social media, by the internet. And this is an example of the location of users of the violent neo-Nazi website Iron March, where you had also groups such as National Action, which was banned in the UK, which is classified as a terrorist organization, communicating on this website, but also other violent extremists that were really communicating across the Atlantic Ocean, in particular the connections between the US neo-Nazi scene, or the US white supremacists, and the European equivalents are very strong, but also in other parts of the world. A second trend is that there's a much bigger overlap now, especially online, with the whole misogynist manosphere, which is basically a mosaic of different misogynist, anti-feminist subcultures who spread hatred against women. And there were a few examples from years ago. Elliot Rodger was one of the first people who really turned this misogynist incel ideology into something on a global scale that became well known. to everyone. But then there were Alec Minassian, who committed the Toronto van attack in 2018. And of course, we also had the latest attack in Plymouth that was also linked to this form of misogynist hate. Now, the Prime Minister has refused to label misogyny as a hate crime, unfortunately, because I do think this is one of the key threats we face for the future, and is really something where, on an international level, we see that some countries have taken the step to also include misogyny in their list of terrorist threats. For example, Canada has done this. And on the other side, and this is a bit of a paradox, on the other side we also see that the presence of women in the far-right is rising. That actually a lot of far-right extremist groups see women as very fundamental to spreading their hateful ideas on a global scale, because they know that women often have a better reach, that they are then seen as more legitimate if they have women as part of their community. So quite similar also like what ISIS was doing in terms of state building. Of course, the white supremacists would also see their end goal of building a white nationalist state as impossible without women. So they're actively trying to recruit women, and you can see Miss Hitler competition. This took place in the UK, was launched by National Action. This is one example. But you also have female anti-feminist or female misogynist communities that are spreading their ideas online, which was a complete puzzle to me, because how can you be misogynistic as a woman? But there are women who are for domestic violence, who are against women's rights. And this is, yeah, I would say also one of the newest dynamics that I learned about and that I also wrote up in my book, Going Dark. Recruitment and also communication has become much more gamified, and unfortunately even attacks have become more gamified. So when you remember, if you remember the terrible attacks in Christchurch, New Zealand, that was the starting point of what I would call the age of gamified terrorism. ISIS, of course, on the jihadist side, we had gamification of recruitment. We saw that ISIS used glossy propaganda materials, used video games to lure young people in. The far-right has been doing the same. But now we've even seen the gamification of the attack itself. So the live streaming of an attack using this first-person ego shooter angle. And then a lot of these white supremacists turned this footage into video game versions, where you could see for every person that was shot, you could see the ammunition go down and the points go up. So really, really terrible. This is an example of a neo-Nazi trolling army that I joined for my research. They had even ranks where you could be promoted to higher levels if you were doing particularly well at spreading hateful campaigns or at creating hateful memes. And then you had an incentive to rise up. It was like a video game. Trojan horse campaigns are another trend, basically hiding behind the idea of human rights, but at the same time spreading hateful ideologies. The white nationalist movement, Generation Identity, has been doing a particularly good job at this, unfortunately. So they're often, for example, hiding behind women's rights to spread anti-Muslim ideas and to spread hatred against Muslim communities by saying that all Muslims are offenders or are rapists. And they've also been hiding behind other campaigns that were really just carrying the label of, for example, Me Too, hijacking that label, or hijacking other human rights hashtags, and then really subtly leaking in their hateful ideologies. Gamified terrorism, I already mentioned this, but these are pictures of the live streaming and of these shootings. I don't usually show this, but since this is a closed event, I think it's important also in terms of journalism. It's really important to not mention their names or to not show pictures. I think in this case it's quite interesting to see also that they've had lots of ideological and tactical inspiration that has led to a kind of copycat terrorism, which we've seen on the ISIS side of things, where one terrorist attack inspired the next one. We've seen exactly the same dynamic over the last couple of years on the white supremacist side, where the attackers that came after the Christchurch shooter, this is the one in Halle in Germany, used exactly the same subculture references, even mentioned the previous attackers, and were really inspired by their manifestos and their materials that were left behind. the materials that were left behind also led to something that has turned into a race for higher scores in terrorist attacks, which is a hugely dangerous dynamic, because I saw conversations online between white supremacists saying, oh, I want to beat Anders Breivik, the Norwegian terrorist who is still perceived as the person who achieved the highest score because he murdered so many people. And so they look at this as if it was a video game, and they want to create an even bigger damage or have an even higher lethality rate, which is a terrible dynamic. This also means that, of course, a lot of their accounts and their content has been removed from social media, but they've also built up their own alternative safe havens. They've built up their own social media websites, their own crowdsourcing websites, and also their own even alt-right dating platforms, which I really don't recommend you go on. This is really disturbing. Do-it-yourself terrorism. This is already one of the last slides. I think I'm running out of time here. But this is again one of the future trends where we've already had a few cases of terrorists that have launched attacks based on printing their weapons with 3D printers, for example. The Halle attack in Germany did that. Or following bomb-making instructions that could easily be found on the surface web. You don't even have to go to the darknet to find that. So, to sum up and to maybe come to a more positive conclusion, I do think we can tackle this threat, but I believe we have to really focus on a solution that looks both at early prevention, so really looks at internet citizenship, which doesn't just include digital literacy, but really digital citizenship and digital civil courage. So what does it mean to be an online citizen? And what does it mean if someone is attacked in front of me on the street? I would probably intervene. But we don't really see the same level of engagement and of intervention and of civil courage in the online space. And I think that really needs to be taught in an educational setting, that what does it mean to be a bystander if you see an online attack against a journalist, against a researcher, against a political activist. And intervention. Again, I think we have lots of really good models of intervention and de-radicalization in the offline space, and we can still do a lot more to apply this expertise that we've gathered offline to the online spaces, to create outreach programs for some of these really darker platforms and darker corners on the internet. I'll leave it here and leave the rest for the discussion and for the other speakers. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think I rudely forgot to ask everyone to please begin eating, because the mains will be served very shortly, so don't worry about the clunking sounds. Bon appétit.
Before I start, I just want to say the database is very welcome. Having spent several years in the Home Office, it's a surprise to people on the outside that actually independent research and open source information and facts about some of these individuals, especially where it's in the kind of grey area of legality or illegality, is incredibly helpful. Although I suspect the civil service might ask you about whether it's GDPR compliant, it's very helpful to the people working there. As everyone here today knows, there is a battle going on around the world for the meaning and the heart and the soul of Islam. And to many people in this country, that battle is very complicated and even bewildering. There's the ancient split between Sunni and Shia and factions within those traditions. There are tribal rivalries and hostilities, autocracies, theocracies and democracies, states fighting proxy wars, countries sponsoring insurgents and terrorists, ministers who appear to report to their own intelligence agencies, whole regions that are lawless and beyond the control of their governments, and terror groups that are more powerful than the states where they reside. And there are even peace deals, and very welcome peace deals, between Israel and its former enemies in Arab states who realize their greatest danger comes not from a small democracy that is interested in living in peace and security, but a shared enemy in the form of the regime that governs the Islamic Republic of Iran. But to a country like ours, which is secular, increasingly agnostic, and even atheistic, it's all very confusing. Among the followers of a religion many of us don't really know about or understand and read about only in the context of war and violence, there is a conflict between interpretations of the true faith, between scriptural literalism and modernity, between tradition and secularism, between allies of the West and Islamist enemies, and between indiscriminate violence and the rule of law. And sometimes, as we know, the violence reaches us here. We've seen bombs in London and Manchester, marauding attacks, the murder of a British soldier in London in broad daylight, and even an attack just yards away from here by the Houses of Parliament. And we've seen serious attacks of many kinds that have been thwarted thanks to the police and the intelligence services. And we've become almost inured to the violence. Following each successful attack, we have a short period of anguished conversation, but we soon return to normal, and the conversations are normally the same. So some raise economic or social exclusion, but the perpetrators are quite often educated and sometimes well off. Some raise our foreign policy, as though the extremism was caused by the wars of the last 20 years rather than the other way around. And some look to blame our imperial history, as though Britain uniquely is targeted for crimes we committed uniquely more than 100 years ago. But as we've seen in Norway over the last couple of days, that is not the case. In other criminal contexts, we would call this victim blaming. But the truth is, in this war within the Islamic world, we in Britain and Europe are on the periphery. We're affected by the conflict, and it's very dangerous for us, but we're not central to it. And where there is a clear risk to our national interests, such as when ISIS tried to create its caliphate just a few hours away by plane from here, we were right to play our part in its destruction. But where there's no such risk, we've been wrong, I think, to insert ourselves into the wars of others, and wrong to believe that if we can somehow impose democracy and liberalism through military intervention, that might solve the problem of extremism and violence. But regardless of these decisions, we face danger. In some cases, this might come from a small number of refugees who are unaccustomed to living in peace and freedom and among attitudes to women and girls that are different to the country they came from. In other cases, it might come from our own citizens who have travelled overseas to fight and then returned home. But in many cases, the danger comes from people who were born and raised here in Britain, educated in accordance with liberal and pluralistic values, and given all the opportunities of an open and modern economy. And we have to ask ourselves, honestly, because actually I don't think we do this enough, why is this happening? Over the last decade or so, I declare my interest as somebody who worked in government in that time, I think we have got better at recognising the role played by ideology, where once the intelligence agencies and police, and even ministers and officials, tended to focus only on the sharp end, trying to investigate plots and arrest and lock up terrorists and stop bombs going off, we now have a better understanding of the need to tackle the ideology behind the danger. And that ideology, as many people here today will understand, is the ideology of Sayyid Qutb, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the various dangerous individuals and organisations related to them. But if we're really honest, I think this is faint praise for the government and for Britain. We were foolish to tolerate the extremist ideology that existed in our midst for many years. But even now, the state, politicians, and many others engage, sometimes deliberately, and sometimes through ignorance or carelessness, with people and organisations to whom they should not be giving the legitimacy of their public contact, and they should be giving the cold shoulder. On one hand, the state is saying we need to do more to stand up to a dangerous ideology, while on the other, the police are holding community meetings with, and government departments are sometimes consulting, organisations that perpetuate those beliefs, and that's not good enough. But even if we were better at dealing with the ideology, the focus on ideology, I think, gives us some false comfort. And it's very easy for politicians to say, we distinguish between the dangerous ideology of Islamism and the great religion of Islam. But just as you can be racist and bigoted without being a fascist or a Nazi, so people who are not Islamists can perpetuate extremist beliefs despite their lack of an ideological cause. And it is the case that we have beliefs and attitudes among people here in Britain that we should not be prepared to tolerate, whether that is homophobia, misogyny, anti-Semitism, hatred and contempt for people based on their race, religion, or lifestyle, intolerance to people with different values, rage and the threat of violence towards people who choose to leave their faith and culture that they were born into. This cultural extremism, for want of a better term, is, I think, at least as dangerous as the ideology. It's more prevalent, it's easier to excuse, but it helps to create the environment in which ideological and violent extremism can grow. So we have incidents like the Trojan Horse affair in Birmingham, my home city, where a group of religious hardliners took over secular state schools and imposed their beliefs on the pupils. We've had divisive community politics in places like Tower Hamlets. We have a teacher in Batley who's still in hiding, still unable to do his job or go home, and still fearing for his life and the lives of his family members after he taught a lesson compliant with the law and compliant with his school's policy about blasphemy. And these attitudes are promoted too often and too freely by the kind of rabble-rousers we sometimes see in the media, but also unelected community representatives to whom councillors and members of parliament are often in thrall, and sometimes by clerics in mosques. They want to promote the idea that there is a clash of civilizations and this is a them and us situation. I don't think there needs to be a civilizational clash of this kind, but actually they are right about something, and that is this is a them and an us situation. We shouldn't really disagree with them about that. We should disagree with them about where we draw the line, about who is us and who is them. The extremists want to say that Islam and the West are fundamentally at odds with one another. They want to say that any criticism of their extremism is criticism of Islam and all Muslims. But that is obvious nonsense and not the real divide. The real divide is between those of us who accept the principles of living in a pluralistic society and those of us who don't. So in this country, everyone's free to practice their faith and wear their religious symbols. They're free to establish their faith schools and give their children, including girls, the best education possible. They're free to build their own churches, synagogues, temples, and mosques and worship freely. And these are the benefits of living in a pluralistic society. That's why so many people from around the world would like to come and live here. But to live in a pluralistic society, quite obviously, is to accept a fundamental deal in which you have to accept not just your rights, but your responsibilities as well. You don't just have the freedom to live as you want to live, you have to respect the rights of other people to do that too. And you have to respect the values and the social norms and the institutions and the way of life that makes that deal possible. The rule of law, democracy, equality, free speech, and respect for minorities. Now, this, to me, is the real divide, and it must be the logic of our response to extremism. We need to give a much more positive and self-confident account of our national story and our way of life. We need to accept the us and them divide and say to people, choose the right side, choose pluralism and tolerance, and we will support you with everything we have. But choose hatred and intolerance, and we will come down on you like a ton of bricks. In practice, the challenge in front of us is to work out how to turn that from principle into practice. And we're quite often told, I was certainly told for 5 years solidly in the Home Office, that this is all just a bit too difficult, that it's very difficult to define extremism, that some beliefs are just social conservatism, and that much of what we're talking about isn't illegal. But based on the experience over the last several decades of tackling racism in this country, I think we have a lesson and a template. And if you replace the word extremism with the word racism, I think it becomes a little bit clearer. So some things should be illegal and carry stiff penalties. Some things perhaps should be aggravated offences. Some things that are not yet illegal perhaps should be. And some things that should never be illegal should be confronted and challenged. And in the case of the anti-racism campaign, we've had formal campaigns, we've had plot lines and television series and lessons in school, which has helped us to take on racist attitudes quite successfully. And that, I think, is a model. So in other words, there's plenty for the government and the public sector to do, but there's plenty more for the rest of us as society as a whole, but as individuals to do too. But we're also going to need help, because this isn't just a domestic matter. The schools, seminaries and mosques we have in Britain are dominated by Deobandis and Salafists who don't actually reflect the British Muslim population. So according to research from 2017, more than 41% of British mosques are Deobandi and 9.4% are Salafist, and those are growing percentages. In prisons, 2/3 of Muslim chaplains are Deobandi of a literalist persuasion, but most British Muslims have traditionally followed Sufi and mystical theology. So it was more about love and compassion and less about hatred and separatism and literalism. And this trend didn't come out of the blue from nowhere. It came from overseas. It was funded from foreign countries. And just as wealthy states helped to foment the revolution in the first place, I think we now need to ask the governments of Muslim countries, and not necessarily the ones who were behind the original problem, to help to fund and organise the counter-revolution or counter-reformation or whatever you want to call it. We need authentic Muslim voices to develop and encourage ways of allowing Muslims to stay true to their faith, to lead good religious lives, but also to live in accordance with the values and traditions of the country they live in, and all the polling shows they're very proud to call home. So none of this is easy. It requires difficult truths to be confronted, and I cannot say enough how difficult it is for politicians to confront these truths. It's a complicated world, and one they find a little queasy. It requires them, politicians and government officials, to learn about things that they don't really know about and sometimes feel intimidated by. It requires much more than changing laws. It means changing hearts and minds. And it does also require help and support from friends and allies across the country, but beyond the country as well. But it is a hugely important task. At the moment, it feels quiet. We're not debating it at a national level, but we should be. And next time there's an attack, we will have the same sort of feverish debates for a few days. But for that reason, and for the reason of the enormous social damage that this is causing in communities up and down the country, regardless of the violence, it's a challenge we can't duck anymore. But it is a mission that we must all rise to.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it that you made time during a busy weekday lunchtime to be here to help launch EMAN. In summer of this year, Mo called me from Dubai and said, introduced himself, and I was struck by the fact that about 12 years ago we tried to do something similar in this country, but here was a young practicing Muslim from the silent majority, if you like, who put his own resources behind starting this organization. And that really is the future for many, many more Muslims, that we reclaim our own faith from the fanatics. So I thank Mo for taking this initiative and starting your work here in London. We're grateful to you. And echoing what Nick said, the need for Muslims and authentic Muslims from the Muslim majority world to help recalibrate the debate here needs people like you, so thank you. Deeply privileged for... It's a great honor to be part of this initiative, but also this panel. Julia, I've known you for many years. Thank you for the work you do going underground with the dark forces and the personal risks you've taken. We applaud your work. Nick, you've been on the front line of combating extremism, terrorism, separatism of all hues right at the heart of government. And I remember meeting you during and after. Very few friends, by the way, take your calls when they're in government. Nick always did. And those tours of Downing Street, but more importantly, the fact that you took a physical hit, if you like, while you were in government, but you continued to fight this fight for this great country. So thank you, Nick, for being on the front line. My great friend Tom Tugendhat last month made headlines. This weekend made headlines again with his dancing at the Tory party conference with Michael Gove. But Tom's been on the front line globally in more ways than one. I've just been sat next to Tom watching him taking notes in Arabic. Very few parliamentarians can do that. Speaks a whole range of European languages as well as Dari. And with global leaders representing Britain around the world in the coming years and decades, we're in good hands. So Tom, we wish you luck and thank you for joining us today. Now, I can speak, ladies and gentlemen, about the threats that we face imminently. The 43,000 subjects of interest that Her Majesty's government is looking at right now as we speak. I can speak to you about the fact that there are, as Nick identified, over 1,000 mosques with connections to ideology linked to the Taliban's Deoband mothership. I can carry on talking about the increase in the far right and the other forms of extremism that Julia rightly identified. But I think all of that's too late. It's too downstream. And the real challenge for us isn't the silence of many, many British Muslim organizations on the Taliban, but what Leon Trotsky warned us, that you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. So for all of us who don't want to talk about the extremism and the terrorism, who find it too uncomfortable to talk about brown fascists, i.e. Islamists, or are just too comfortable talking about the white Nazis but don't want to talk about Islamist extremism, the point is that we didn't choose this war chose us, whether it's the 1993 World Trade Center attacks, or whether it's 9/11, 7/7, and the range of attacks that keep following on since then, is that it is not the West and its Muslim allies and the vast majority of the Muslim world. And don't forget, in countries such as Pakistan, the vast majority of the victims of terrorism are Muslims. So this is, as Nick correctly identified, not a clash of civilizations, that puts Muslims against the West, but the vast majority of Muslims and others side by side with the West and the civilized world against the subversives. And in that, the forever wars or the clash of civilizations narrative, which I'll come to in a moment, comes from the other side. The gentleman, maybe the wrong word, gentleman, but the terrorist who committed the 7th of July terrorist atrocities here in London, talked about, Mohammed Siddiq Khan, MSK. You go online, look at the video. He was addressing his daughter, a child, and saying that, I'll see you in the next life. I'm sorry I won't be here for your birthday and seeing you grow up. He had a conviction of literalist belief in the afterlife that justified killing other people. And in that same belief, in a similar video, he then speaks to the rest of the country and in perfect Yorkshire English says, "You are at war with my people." How was it that a British subject, a British citizen, is declaring war against fellow Brits because he has an affiliation and an association with people in Iraq? it's a different world, and I want to explore that world a little bit with you through three things. But before that, as I say, we didn't choose that war chose us. When I say us, I mean the West and the vast majority of the world's Muslims, Jews, Christians, Hindus, Sikhs, Chinese and others who are on the receiving end of the hatred that Julia and Mo identified. Clausewitz, the great military strategist, said again and again that when you're under attack or when you're at war, you must attack the center of gravity. I mean, if you're not attacking the center of gravity, you're always on the defensive. And my point is that we have in the West, especially in this great country that still leads the English-speaking and wider world, have constantly been on the defensive rather than going on the offensive. And the following three themes stand out to me as the center of gravity on the enemy camp. And by enemy camp, again, I reiterate that the vast majority of Muslims are on our side. And the vast majority of Muslims are on the receiving end of the extremism and the terrorism. The first victims from Hassan al-Banna's Muslim Brotherhood were fellow Muslims. The first assassination that the Muslim Brotherhood carried out was against the Egyptian Prime Minister. The first global assassination they carried out was against the Egyptian president that made peace with Israel. So those are the victims. It came to the West much later. So don't fall for the narrative that it's all about the West. So my point is that, as Clausewitz says, you attack the sense of gravity. But he defined, to win war, it's the employment of the available resources for a predetermined end. Now, when we employ our existing resources for a predetermined end, firstly, we're not employing all of our existing resources, schools, media, and so on. What is that predetermined end? And Mo touched on that, as well as Nick and Julia, and that is the existing liberal world order, the world order of nation states, the world order of individual citizens who have a contract with the state. That's what's at jeopardy, and that's what offends the extremists on all hues. And it's that predetermined end that we've got to defend. Now, the three themes that I want to highlight to you is, first, in terms of the center of gravity, is in their minds, in the minds of the enemies, whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood on the one side and Daesh and Hamas and Hezbollah and Houthis and others on the other side, that entire spectrum. They are the first ones who advanced the clash of civilizations thesis. And it was not Sam Huntington, and it was not Bernard Lewis. In fact, if you study Sam Huntington's book, The Clash of Civilizations and the Future of World Order, you see him referencing again and again the writings of Sayyid Qutb, as Nick correctly identified. Now, when they say that they're up against the clash of civilizations, they oppose the following things. They want to have a caliphate-ranging worldview. They believe in a Dar al-Harb that is forever expanding, that there are frontiers that continue to move. And that's why they continue to target Rome and Delhi and Jerusalem and other world capitals. But more importantly, for that extremist worldview, what they reject is the Enlightenment. What they reject is the secular settlement that we have in the modern world. And that is not to in any way denigrate Muslims. I put it to you that without Ibn Rushd, Averroes, the great Spanish Muslim philosopher, we don't have the Enlightenment, the unleashing of reason, the honoring by St. Thomas Aquinas of Aristotle, and from that, the birth of, John Locke studied Arabic here at Westminster School. He studied Arabic and Hebrew. Without John Locke, we don't have the US Constitution or the Declaration of Independence, and indeed we don't have the settlement in this part of the world that allows for Jews, Muslims, Christians, and others to thrive. And it's that worldview of the Enlightenment that they oppose, and it's that Islam of Ibn Rushd that goes back to the Spanish Islamic heritage influenced by the Arabs that they oppose. That you go into any Islamist bookshop across London and across the northwest of this country, you find books that go back to publications that are problematic, and that whole heritage is ignored. Now, what did the Enlightenment give us, and why is it the center of gravity that they attack? It's individual liberty. It's the right to exercise our own religious conscience. It's gender equality, and it's racial equality, and it's a citizenship of an individual with the state. Now, that is unique. That is not something that had been done by the Romans or the Greeks or other civilizations. That's something that was unleashed, in my view, by Ibn Rushd in Spain, through Thomas Aquinas, reached the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and the Reformation era, from which we are all beneficiaries. And that is our heritage, and that's what we defend. And that's what they wish to attack, and that's what they wish to undo. From that civilizational alignment between Muslims and the West, my last 2 points are as follows, that we test them on the following 2 grounds. Their center of gravity is to undo the Enlightenment heritage, the liberal, democratic, secular world order that we have of nation states. But they test us on the following two grounds, and if we give grounds an inch to any of this, they sniff our weakness and they keep growing. The second issue, therefore, is how do we measure this civilizational health? We measure that through the history of the last millennia. When Joseph was welcomed by Pharaoh, the Egyptians thrived. When Moses and the Hebrews were expelled from Egypt, Egypt fell, Egypt declined. Similarly, similar incidents you see with the Romans. When the Romans were open to the thriving of the Jewish community, I mention the Jewish community because it's a thriving minority community across the world. Where that thrives, civilization thrives. Where that community suffers, civilizations, they are the canaries in the coal mine, if you like. Civilization starts to struggle. You see that with Muslims. You know, when Muslims were confident in the year 636, Sayyidina Umar invited Jewish people back into Jerusalem. When Muslims were weak in Andalusia in 1492, they get expelled. It's the Egyptian Muslims who were then at the height who welcomed them. Similarly with Rome, and even here in Europe, you know, with Germany and the atrocities that were committed in the last century, when civilization or a nation is weak, the first people that are offered up to the altar of hatred tend to be our Jewish cousin, our Jewish forebears. And in that sense, what we're seeing now is something that we should be worried about. The national security of this country is at risk because these are important citizens who've pioneered the very bridge on which Muslims walk today. Had it not been for the blood of the 6 million and more people that lost lives in the Holocaust, Muslims and others would not thrive here. And yet today we're seeing this leftist Islamist nexus on our campuses and elsewhere that is a real concern for the health of our nation. The third and the most important of the civilizational tests is how we treat women. This is, again, that's something unique to the Enlightenment and unique to the achievements of the West. It's not something that the Greeks or the Romans were able to achieve. And what we're seeing here across many Muslim communities in particular is that marriages are not registered in the legal sense. There's a Sharia court separatism at play, and more than 100,000 marriages at the moment are being conducted without them being safeguarded by the secular rule of law. Now, why is that a threat? It's a threat because women then want to break out of that marriage and they're told, oh no, you weren't married. That was just an arrangement. And then their divorce rights, their inheritance rights, and their access to wealth and inheritance is minimized. And that's a real concern. We can't let 5 million Muslims in this country have a different legal system based on Sharia on the grounds of law. You know, a Muslim woman getting married in Israel, Afghanistan, and elsewhere comes here and she has full rights, but a British Muslim woman doesn't. And, you know, this is the country of the suffragettes, this is the country of Mary Wollstonecraft, this is the country that gave us, you know, female prime ministers, it's a country that's given us a Roman empress, it's a country that's given us, you know, monarchs and prime ministers who are female. We should not be afraid to say British Muslim women have full rights as equal citizens as everybody else, and we're not there yet. So women are the barometers, if you like, of the health of the rule of law in this country, and there's concern around those issues. Now, I end by saying that those three issues are the center of gravity because Islamists despise gender equality, Islamists despise pluralism that includes our Jewish forebears and our cousins. If it were not for the Jewish God, we don't have Christianity. If it's not for the Jewish belief in the one God, we don't have Islam. It's to that Jewish heritage that we own where we are, all of us today. And that's what they wish to cut, attack, undermine, destroy. So our national security depends on us going further upstream and understanding the center of gravity on which we stand and which our enemies wish to attack. And it's once we've reached that conclusion, I feel that then our responses will be different. Until we have that debate and are settled, we are constantly on the defensive, and this great country deserves to be better than on the defensive. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I don't know about you, but I've heard a lot of speeches in my time, and I've given quite a few, but that was quite singularly the best I've heard in many, many years, and I'm incredibly privileged to have heard it. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here today and to speak with you, because this question of extremism that we've been talking about this afternoon is one that, of course, has raised its head in the United Kingdom and indeed in many Western countries in various different ways, in ways that have challenged us and have forced themselves onto the front pages of our newspapers. It's really a fundamental question that has, in so many ways, changed our lives in the last 20 years, and particularly, as we remember, of course, at this time, 20 years ago, the 9/11 attacks that really did change our world, and for me, changed my life quite fundamentally, as it saw me sent from enjoying rather a pleasant life in the city of London to going and fighting wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. But the reality is that what we've been hearing today is not a UK phenomenon, it's not a Western phenomenon, it's not American, it's not New Zealand, it is truly global. And I think it's worth putting into context where we sit and why the stability of the nation states that we rely on, the alliances that we depend on, have been so fundamentally challenged. And I thought I'd start off by talking about three things. The first is the liberal secular democracies that I was going to talk about, but frankly I have no need to because Ed has covered them so extraordinarily beautifully and rather more brilliantly than I ever could, and the fundamental challenges that we have in defending ourselves. The second is on the theocracies, those groups of nations, those groups of thoughts, really, that challenge the Westphalian idea of the nation state, that really undermine the principles on which the liberal order that Ed just described is so fundamentally based, that idea of individual rights, that idea of the rights of a society that can rise in competition to, but also in partnership with neighbours. And the third is of the centralising authoritarian state. And I'm slightly surprised, but I'm going to bring up, I'm slightly surprised because I'm the first person to do it, but I'm going to bring up China in the third one. Because I think what we're seeing in a fundamental sense actually is a challenge of three different forms of governance, and three different ways in which human beings on the globe today are trying to understand the way in which the world works, our place within it, and the challenges that we all face. Because the truth is we're all facing very, very similar challenges that we're addressing differently. The first of them, of course, is globalization. I mean that not just in the sense that these microphones are probably made in China, that our clothes are probably made in places from Bangladesh to Huddersfield, that our, that our lives are absolutely fundamentally intertwined with droughts in Brazil and with rubber plantations around the world, and that very much all of the trade and the commerce that we're seeing affecting the UK economy at the moment, whether it's the gas price in Russia or whether it's the port blockages in the western United States or indeed in Felixstowe, are absolutely intertwined. Of course, that's part of it. And of course, it's true that the pandemic, or as Julia so brilliantly described, the various implications of the pandemic that tie us to the globe in a very fundamental way, again, demonstrate a form of globalization. That's a second area. But the third, and I think the sort of fundamental one, is actually much more fundamental than either of those two. It's to do with place and identity. And I think wherever you look in the world today, you are seeing people struggling with the concept of place and identity. You're seeing communities, whether they are Han Chinese or whether they are Northern Ireland, Ulster, or whether they are United States Hispanic, you're seeing different people struggling with what it means to be in a place, what it means to have an identity, and what it means to feel secure within that environment. And different nations are responding in different ways, and more importantly, perhaps, different political concepts are responding in different ways. Some are responding, as Ed is trying to encourage us to, as nation states looking at pluralism and looking at the idea of the individual right within the social order, the right of women, of minorities, the right of religious groups, the right of various different people to have an identity within a collective whole. Others are responding, and this is where Qutb is the classic example, but there are many others, are responding with a form of radicalism, a singular identity politics. And yes, we've been talking about Islam today, but actually, as Julia quite rightly mentioned, this is not just an Islamic situation. We see it in the Christian right, we see it in some Jewish communities, we see it in many, indeed, secular communities, where we see it in various forms of extremism, who define themselves in full opposition to the rest. but not just in full opposition in a national sense, but when you talk about some of these groups, the theocracy which I'm talking about is not just to do with God. It can indeed be a secular theocracy, a belief system that simply identifies that the political philosophy is global, is all-encompassing, but is superior to all others. And it comes with an identity, an ethnic, very often, grouping that goes with it. And the third is a much more centralized, in some ways the most old-fashioned of the three, a much more centralized and dominating center of power. And that is what we're seeing out of China. And I think these three different ideas are currently challenging themselves in a global sense. I think we're seeing the expression of the centralized superstate, the centralized empire being expressed by Beijing and its communist leadership, communist in the loosest sense of the term. We're seeing the theocracy being expressed by groups like some groups affiliated with the Taliban. I wouldn't overstate it because many of the Taliban forces are actually not theocratic in that sense. They're simply tribal militias. But many of the groups identified with them, whether it's ISIS or ETIM or various other different forms of radical groupings, which see themselves as a globalized theocracy. And then the third, of course, is the nation state, which Ed so beautifully expressed. And it's worth thinking why this challenge has come about. It's come about because actually, yes, the global environment has changed. We are fundamentally more connected. That's left people feeling more lost. But it's also come about, and I would argue this quite strongly, because of a lack of confidence, because of a change in how we see ourselves, in how we're willing to project ourselves. Because what we're really talking about here is not just the world as it affects us, but us as we shape and influence the world. The world that we live in today was fundamentally made by people, mostly men, admittedly, but people who had seen the devil. They were absolutely certain that they had seen the true horror of what human beings could muster. They had seen the camps at Auschwitz. They had seen the rape of Nanking. They had seen the mushroom clouds over Hiroshima. They had seen the graves at Normandy. And they knew, quite fundamentally, what genuine state failure, what true failure of human collective action could lead to. To simplify, they'd seen the devil in the face, and they knew that the devil was real. Over the last 80 years, very few people have, or very few people in the countries that have been pillars of that have. Because what we've seen is we've seen that the pillars that we built up, those pillars of the United Nations, signed just over there in Westminster Central Hall, the pillars of cooperation on trade with GATT, cooperation through the EU, through NATO, through many different other organizations and global collective decision-making bodies, we've seen them challenged and lose legitimacy. Sometimes they've lost legitimacy because internally they have corrupted themselves. Sometimes they've lost legitimacy because others have failed to invest in them. But we've seen a fundamental challenge in the stability of the international order that we built up since the 1940s, because we have failed to remember the true price of disaster. And so what we're seeing today, I would argue, is not so much a rise of the other two, of the theocracies or the centralized states, but actually the retreat of those countries that really do understand how to build cooperation and how to, in Ed's words, build a political settlement that actually works for all of us. And this is where what I really wanted to get onto was how do we get out of this? Because it's quite easy, as you know, to observe a problem. And indeed, one of the greatest tricks in Parliament today is to observe problems from many interesting angles and point to the various different facets with which it is difficult to address. But the real challenge for all of us actually is not observing problems, but addressing them. And I'm not a defeatist. I do actually happen to believe in belief. I do actually happen to believe that faith matters. And faith, not just a Christian faith or an Islamic faith or a Jewish faith, or indeed a secular faith, but faith in our ability to act, faith in a future, faith in the ability of human beings to self-associate and to look forward. And that's where I want to come on to now. Because faith depends, whichever form you choose, but faith depends fundamentally, I think, on two things. The first is a belief in the future, and the second is an understanding of justice. And this is where I think we've really got to get down to what we're looking at properly. Because so much of the conversation that we are having at the moment is millenarian. It's leading to an idea of the end of times, the end of the world, the idea that actually the clash of civilization, whether you're Qutb or whether you're one of the more extremist end of some of the environmental movements, or whether you're at some of the more extremist end of some of the nationalist or indeed ethnic movements, the idea of pushing towards a clash, pushing towards a confrontation in your own lifetime within the years, months, maybe even weeks that you see before you, leads to a narrowness of thinking and an inability to understand that actually what we're doing is trying to build a future. And that's why turning it around and talking about a future beyond the lives of even our children is so fundamental to creating a culture, to creating a civilization that works. And the second is justice, and we were speaking about this earlier. Because there are two fundamental things that I think a government must do. The first, of course, and the obvious one, is the sole legitimate use of force. It's a pretty standard understanding of what a state must do. But the second is to do justice. And here, if you'll forgive me, I'm going to go on to a story from my time in Afghanistan and when I realized that we were failing. For me, the failures didn't come when we started to get hammered in Sangin or to start to lose territory outside district centres. For me, it came when I was in a village, a peaceful village, in the Upper Helmand Valley. And talking to some elders there, we were talking about a land dispute, and a pretty standard land dispute in those parts of the world, which was a land dispute that basically revolved around who got access to how much water over which period of time. It's not an unusual question to ask. In fact, I think I'm right in saying the oldest court in the world still sits in Spain, literally allocating water as it has done since the 6th or 7th century. It's an incredibly old form of justice. These villagers, though, hadn't gone to the government, they hadn't gone to the district chief, they hadn't come to the foreigners to ask for this to be resolved. They'd gone to the Taliban. And in doing so, they'd effectively they'd opted out of the system of government, of the system of justice that we had created, or rather the Afghan government had tried to create and we had tried to support. And that first erosion for me was absolutely fundamental to where you could see the legitimacy of the state going. And you may think that is just an example about one small area and one small place, and that if you look at countries like ours in the United Kingdom or the United States, where justice is, just over there you have the Supreme Court, you have wonderful judges in their wonderful robes, you have hundreds of years of tradition, you would say, why does justice matter so much here? Well, it matters because actually people here today, even now, are opting out of justice. People are opting out of justice in different ways. One, people are looking to settle some disputes where we have a lack of policing, where we have an absence of law enforcement here in the UK. And two, at a higher level, if you like, some businesses, some individuals are looking to operate without justice or rather under different forms of justice at a transnational level. And we're seeing this with different ways in which people are organising contracts and organising their future. And this is where we come into where the technology of the future really does challenge the ideas that we're talking about today. Because talking about crypto assets, talking about the different ways in which currencies are going to be used, is not just about a settlement mechanism, it's not just digital gold. It's actually also about the way in which disputes are recognised and who has the authority, and what organisation, what legitimacy has the authority to settle them. So those two initial elements that I've raised, they are challenges, but they also offer an opportunity to determine a better future. Because the reality is that if you look around the world today, if you look at the way in which not just businesses but actually people associate, if you look at the way in which countries, when they are free to choose, do choose, people choose to associate with other free countries. You see this through population movements, you see this through migration flows, you see it constantly through various different forms of economic selection. That every time there is a genuine free choice, people choose those groups, those orders, those establishments that actually have legitimacy in the sense that that Ed so beautifully expressed. Now, I think we can go further. I think we can actually reinforce the different forms of governance, that we established in the last 70, 80 years. I think we can actually build on the different forms of settlement and the different forms of legitimacy that we created. But again, it comes down to belief. Because the fundamental failure of the West, and I use that term incredibly loosely because I include South Korea and Japan just as much as I include the United States and Canada, the way in which that the democratic, liberal, civilized, and yes, I do think they are fundamentally civilized countries have behaved, is sadly to sit back and to assume a victory, to cease to believe, but instead to allow competition at the fundamental core of what I think is the order that keeps us all safe. And we've seen this because we're seeing different votes going different ways. The example of this, the classic examples of this, when you look at UN votes. If you look at the votes in the 1980s, various of our leaders, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, would fight for every single seat on every single UN body. No matter how irrelevant it may have seemed to others, it was always worth a dispute, it was always worth a punch, it was always worth a haggle. They didn't always win, but they did always fight. If you look at the way that the UN bodies are increasingly stacked, that is not the way it's working today. We are not fighting for the seats as hard as we could, we're not partnering with our allies as well as we should, and we're allowing those who fundamentally challenge the principles that we believe in to dominate those areas. We see this when we see things like the Chinese Communist Party apparatchiks dominating the International Telecoms Union, trying to, but thank God not getting, the World Intellectual Property Union and various other of these UN agencies. We're now in the somewhat extraordinary situation where the World Health Organization is led by not just somebody who was appointed by the Chinese Communist Party, but whose former job was as health minister under a government that was led by a terrorist organization, the Tigray People's Liberation Front. It is a pretty extraordinary situation to find ourselves in. And that has all come not because people are choosing China's authoritarian state, nor because people fundamentally believe in the ethnic transnationalism or the ideological transnationalism of theocracy, but because we have taken a back foot, because we have ceased to believe in ourselves. And if you'll forgive the argument of the day, we have decided to argue about sausages rather than principles. Now, that is a pretty extraordinary situation to find ourselves in. And we have only found ourselves in that position because we have chosen it. We have chosen it because we have chosen to believe that the world that we have created is safe, is stable, and faces no risks. But that's why this group really matters and why I pay enormous tribute to you, Mo, for doing it. Because what you're doing is you're reminding us in a very visceral and very personal sense that the devil really does exist. Now, the devil that we've seen through Julia's slides is expressed in various faces. But actually, those faces aren't the faces that matter. The real faces that matter are the ones that Nick spoke about. Not the Hitlers and the Himmlers who stand at the front of the rally, but the millions and millions who cheer them on or silently allow them to walk past. And that is where the challenge for us all comes today. So I think there is a real possibility for a better future. I think there is a genuine hope for a different, stable, global outcome in which the work that Mo's doing, the work that many people here are doing, transforms not just a society, but actually a world into a more prosperous and peaceful and cooperative environment. But it is only possible if we do believe in a real future, not an immediate one, if we believe in justice, and of course, if we believe in cooperation. I don't think any of those are very difficult to achieve, but that none of them are possible without the first, which is belief. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to just applaud all our speakers for their wonderful insights and their words on a multitude of issues. I really want to sort of just focus on the concept of the Westphalian nation state. Initially, it began, obviously, as many of you know, to protect countries and their borders from neighbors, from other sort of adversary states. It protected the countries back then in Europe when the Westphalian Treaty was signed from any form of interference in their internal affairs. But as the world is changing, as sort of emerging technology comes online, such as what Julia mentioned regarding 3D printing, such as cryptocurrency, that Westphalian nation state is also becoming more digital, it's becoming more cyber. And these online challenges are also can also be used and abused by the extremists that we're talking about, the extremists that we're monitoring, the people that seek to sow discord within society and between countries and prevent peace between nations. I'd like to open the floor now for discussion and for any Q&As. We will have a collective discussion amongst everyone here, and I would really, really appreciate if anyone within the audience, and of course the speakers as well, were to provide any sort of advice to EMAN on where we should be really focusing in the future. What should be the key points that we should be focusing on? We've got a database that we're building, and that database requires many hours of work to try to find raw data that really supports the work that we're doing, credible information on certain individuals and organizations, but we're also wanting to build other things as well. So please. Yes, I think we're just going to get the monitor out. Thank you very much. Sorry, gentlemen, we'll just, as we go past, we've got plenty of time for a discussion.
Firstly, thank you very much. Really fantastic presentations. I'm Jewish, and what's concerning me are the universities, and Ed mentioned the universities. The case which is on our minds is Professor Miller at Bristol. I called for his resignation, his sacking 2 years ago. It's taken 2 years to get rid of him. He's not the only one. There's plenty of other ones. And my question is, the borderline between free speech and hate speech, have we got that right legally? Have we got that right in practice? If you look at Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights about free speech, it's not unambiguous free speech. If you take the second half of Article 10, free speech is dependent on, not fomenting social unrest, not preventing crime. Have we got that borderline right? And also, can you comment maybe on the PREVENT programme in the UK? Have we got the PREVENT programme right in principle and in practice? The fact is that young Jewish people in year 12, faced with the choice of universities, now consider the amount of anti-Semitism that they will face at universities. Universities like SOAS, for example, and Manchester are now no-go universities for most Jewish students. We don't have any data on religious affiliations of students because that's not collected. But I know anecdotally that there are some universities which are no-go for Jewish students. And I'm sorry, but in Britain in the 21st century, there's an absolute disgrace that people choose universities by the amount of discrimination they might face. It's just not acceptable. Is the government too hands-off in terms of free speech at universities? There's a lot going on at universities in the name of free speech, which simply shouldn't be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hoffman. Yeah, these are all excellent points, and it's as someone who's not British, I find that very concerning, especially in 21st century Britain, or 21st century sort of anywhere, especially in this country, where, you know, Jewish Britons have been an integral part of the United Kingdom for a very long time. They've helped shape this country, as we all know. So, I mean, I'd let my fellow speakers as well comment on that, especially when it comes to the PREVENT program. But you're right, when it comes to free speech and hate speech, there isn't really that, we haven't sort of defined that in terms of the government sense. We do have the UN definition for hate speech. Free speech is also something that many far-right sort of personalities or influencers use to justify their opinions on certain things. Some people, you know, some people are homophobic and say, well, it's my right, that's free speech. Some people deny the Holocaust and say, well, it's my right, it's free speech. And this is the thing, where do we stop that? Because that is hate speech, that is the conveyor belt that I was talking about. Also, how do we get the government response to actually legal, you know, to put that on paper, to say, there are certain things that we can all put together. There are certain sort of definitions of what is free speech and what is hate speech. Not definitions, sorry, certain differences. You know, X is considered hate speech. Y is considered free speech. However, it is quite, you know, it can be quite sort of mathematic in that sense. But there's plenty of work to be done in that space, I think. And yeah, I'd like to invite, you know, if whoever's sort of more knowledgeable about the PREVENT program.
Yeah, I'm very happy to talk about PREVENT. I talked a lot about PREVENT between 2010 and 2015, which is when all my hair fell out, and PREVENT was one of the reasons why. PREVENT is part of the counter-terrorism strategy, one of the 4 Ps, and it's supposed to do what it says on the tin, prevent people from turning to extremism. It suffered, I think, from what I mentioned in my comments, which is that the whole strategy was, for understandable reasons, focused at the hard end and trying to stop bombs going off. And certainly, if you're working in the intelligence agencies, then you're prepared to talk to people, maybe even do deals, etc., in order to save lives. I think the problem was that the PREVENT strategy was influenced by that mindset, certainly in the days when we inherited the policy. And so there was an awful lot of politicians and public figures sharing platforms with, even endorsing in certain ways, figures who promoted hate, because they were saying, don't let off bombs in this country. Letting off bombs in Israel might be okay. Targeting British troops in Iraq and Afghanistan might be okay. Spreading hatred in a sort of in a not immediately violent way might be okay, and you can kind of see what the problem was. And we tried to change that, and it made the processes much more rigorous, so that so, you know, before we did this, you know, public money was sometimes being given to people with these kinds of attitudes. And I remember realizing with horror there was a document that was being used in the prison system that was using quotations from people like Qaradawi, genuinely, saying, oh, you know, violence in this particular circumstance is bad. But obviously in doing something like that, that is in an indirect way giving some kind of legitimacy to the wider body of thought that Qaradawi promoted, which is mad. So we changed that, and I don't think it's perfect by any means. There's a culture of fear among many of the politicians and officials involved in PREVENT, a desperation to always try to find equivalents. I always used to joke about the dangerous threat from Zoroastrians that officials in the department might imagine to try to show balance. But I think actually if you step back, it's right that we have a prevent program as part of the counterterrorism strategy, but actually we need to have something that's broader, because even if you get prevent right, you're still looking at it through the wrong end of the telescope, because you're still looking at it from the perspective of terrorism. And actually this is a social evil that causes all sorts of problems that don't always lead to bombs, but do still ruin lives. And we need a proper counter-extremism strategy, and we need a much more assertive, and this reflects exactly what Tom was saying, a much more assertive account of our national life, our institutions, and why they should be respected.
May I jump in? My experience of the prevent strategy was pretty limited in the armed forces for rather obvious reasons, until I met a rather extraordinary individual who, as an imam, was serving alongside our troops. And I remember sitting next to him on a plane, and for those of you who've travelled with Her Majesty's Royal Air Force, you'll know that that can be a rather longer experience than you were initially intending. And so we had plenty of time to talk. And one of the things that he said to me, when I sort of expressed moderate surprise that a gentleman dressed as he was and from his community had decided to serve in the armed forces, he said to me, look, it's not your son who's going to blow himself up. It's not your son who's going to meet somebody who's going to poison his mind with hatred. If one of your priests preached this kind of rubbish, they'd be in prison within 10 seconds. But somehow it's tacitly accepted that it's fine to have little Muslim boys and girls seeing the world through poisoned eyes. And there is a tacit racism in this, I'm afraid, that somehow it is okay to tolerate the psychological abuse of Muslim children with the promotion of hatred in a way that it would simply be intolerable if it was a Sunday school or a Sabbath school for another community. And so I think, it is certainly true that prevent is difficult and it requires conversation, it requires openness and dialogue. But it also requires a recognition that fundamentally we're talking about British citizens here. And personally, I don't give a damn where your father and mother are from, and I don't give a damn what religion you practice, and I don't give a damn where your ethnic origins may or may not have been from. If you are here, if you are British, you have exactly the same rights, exactly the same duties, and exactly the same demands of protection from the state, that your children are not poisoned, are not turned into preachers or actors or even simply followers of hate. And we need to recognize that that protection is absolutely a fundamental right to all our communities. Now, since I've been a member of Parliament, something surprised me. A number of years ago, in a community not my own, but in a community where I was meeting various people, I was speaking on behalf of a colleague, some of the members of the community came up to me and said, oh, you speak Dari, will you come and chat to our sort of side group? And the conversation was then in Urdu, which for those of you who know Dari and Urdu will know that the conversation didn't go terribly well, but we did get through it. And one of the things that came up was they were lobbying entirely secretly against a faith school. And I was surprised by this because I'm practicing Roman Catholic. I'm very happy to have my kids go to a Catholic school. And they said, yes, but the problem is, you see, you're never going to find yourself with some Jesuit well, not anymore anyway, with some Jesuit firebrand telling you to kill the Queen. That was a different Elizabethan age. It was a very different time. Whereas we want our kids to grow up as good British citizens, we want them to go to, Anglican schools or Catholic schools or, just the local secular school. Whereas if there is a religious school here, it will be taken over by the people who Nick told us about, and the societal pressure on us will be so great that we will have to send our children there. And this is where, effectively, by tolerating, or rather by not acting in stopping the preachers of hate, what we end up doing is denying these people the fundamental right of a free religious education under the state, as any other community group would have. So I'm afraid I'm very clear on this, which is there are many forms of racism in our country. And the racism of low expectations is just as hateful as every other.
Thank you very much. Just cautious of how much time we've got left. I really want sort of, let everyone be free to leave at 2 o'clock. So we'll have time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions. Sir, over there, thank you very much. Yes. Yeah, just thank you very much. If you could just introduce yourself, that would be fantastic as well. Thank you very much.
I'm Al Mehmet. I'm chair of Migration Watch UK. My president's sitting next to me. Thanks very much for this. Absolutely brilliant initiative. Thank you very much for the delicious lunch, which you missed out on. That's another matter.
Starving
Well, you can't tell.
You've got something better
My question really goes to the core of the whole concept here. As someone who is often accused of being an extremist by people who think differently, accuse me of being an extremist for calling for lower levels of migration, not stopping immigration, lower levels. My question is, how do you determine what constitutes extremism? How will you determine what constitutes extremism?
I think that question applies to different countries very differently. I think when it comes to the UK, do you accept to be a British citizen? A proud British citizen who's also practicing, if you practice a faith, you practice it, but that doesn't contradict, nor does it nor does it clash with your patriotism towards Britain or towards the UK. So basically, and also, how do you view other people? How do you view the people that live in this country, all the different nationalities that live in this country, all the different religions that are practiced in this country? How do you view the laws of this country? Do you agree with them or disagree with them? And if you do disagree with them, what levels what are you willing to do about it? And I think this is what it really comes down to. And I think there is a fine line between hate speech and extremism, and it is a conveyor, but it does lead towards that. And yes, there are many people that have come from across the world, refugees, for instance, that are coming to Britain, and they're not used to the life here. They're not used to the way things work here. But they don't necessarily come from extremist backgrounds. For instance, a lot of Syrians who left Syria, Syria was a very staunchly secular state. They cracked down on the Muslim Brotherhood a very long time ago. So in Syria, just before the war in 2011, the very vast majority of people that left Syria were sort of secular, but practicing Muslims, but they weren't really radical. What radicalized them was the way the war panned out, the way the crisis erupted, and the brutalities on both sides. So my point is, some of these people, when they come to the UK, they may already have an idea of what it's like to live here amongst other people, amongst different people that you were that you were taught that these people are your enemies, or they're different to you, or they've bombed other countries, that they've bombed your country, or they were involved in invading other countries that you consider close to you. So I think that's a sort of, it's about talking to these people, listening to them, but also at the same time figuring out if they do have an ideology, where does that ideology come from? Is it a religiously extremist ideology? Because the vast majority of refugees that come here, they may be religiously inclined. To what extent? We're not sure, but that's what it comes down to. Does anyone else have any?
Yeah, I'd love to say a few words on that, because I've been thinking a lot about the question of what constitutes extremism, because of course every organization has their own definition. We still don't have an international definition, not even of terrorism. Even the United Nations don't have a definition of what is terrorism. Right now they have a list of Al-Qaeda and ISIS affiliated organizations. But yeah, extremism is even harder. I would say from my research, it's always a continuum. I wouldn't say that someone is either an extremist or not. There's a whole continuum of on the extremist spectrum to the moderate spectrum. And the second thing I would say is that it's not a permanent label, but it's a temporary thing. You can move up and down the extremist continuum within a few weeks. And from the research that I've been doing most lately, over the last couple of months, I've been analyzing terrorist manifestos, or manifestos of people who later then went on to commit acts of violence. And I identified the narrative patterns that you could find there. And you can then say, taking it from the most extreme case, from that terrorist manifesto, the more of these patterns in the language and in the narratives that you find there, if you only have 3 or 4 out of these 10 points of narratives, then you might already have some degree of extremism in that, or that you can see in the radicalization pathway of an individual. If you only have 1 or 2 of those narratives, maybe you're at the very kind of moderate end of or the border between moderate and extremist views. And the narratives, I can also tell you, the patterns that we found there was the dehumanization of an outgroup, the demonization of an outgroup, the victimization of an in-group, so clear in versus out-group thinking, which has, of course, been mentioned in various pieces of research, but then also justifications of violence, sometimes the glorification of violent role models, and several other factors that I can't all list here. Also, this is still ongoing research, but I would say this is how we should define extremism, based on the most extreme and violent case that we can see, what is the pattern there, and what is maybe a slightly less extreme version of that, and maybe then a less extreme version of that, and we need different policies being applied to these different points on that continuum, of course. We can't just ban everything that's on the very moderate to extreme side of the spectrum, that's kind of exactly on the border. We need to maybe have a debate here, or talk about, that's actually exactly the point where we have massive dividing lines coming up in society that lead to polarization. It's exactly that border between moderate views and slightly extreme views that are also dangerous, because we have a lot of people that come from there and then go on to radicalize towards the violent end of the spectrum. So I think that's where we have to have an open debate. And that's also maybe concerning your point of where does free speech end and where does hate speech start. I would say exactly when your own free speech limits the free speech of someone else, that's exactly how Immanuel Kant would also frame it. That's where we should stop. That's where someone's free speech should stop. And I believe in the case of anti-Semitism, it's very clear that this silences, intimidates, prevents people from actually attending university. This is where free speech should stop.
Frank?
Frank Gardner, BBC security correspondent. Thanks very much for this very impressive panel. We've heard a lot of very good points, very well backed up today. But I do have a sense of Groundhog Day. And Ed, I'm really addressing this at you, because you, Majid Nawaz and I sat down 12 years ago and you announced you were starting Quilliam, which was an anti-extremist organization combating exactly this kind of bigotism and fascism. There have been numerous organizations that have set up since then: King's College, Institute for Countering Violent Extremism, the Tony Blair Foundation, Henry Jackson Society with their databases. So as a newsman, as a news person, I have to ask myself, what is different about this? Obviously, Mo and I met before, we've discussed this, but what is different about it this time, other than the fact of the very impressive pedigree of the 5 people I'm looking at?
Well, if I was just to begin on the database, we are looking at preachers, and basically not guys with guns. We're looking at the people that sit in the background, people that are not very well known, that do have impact on vulnerable youth, on vulnerable individuals, that have a social media following. These are the people that sort of begin that conveyor belt that I was mentioning. They sort of begin, they breed that intolerance in the beginning. That intolerance then becomes extreme over time, as Julie just mentioned. Sort of that spectrum that they sort of move. Upstream. Yes, exactly. And from there, something across the world happens. Let's say, for instance, the Christchurch terrorist attack. And this person says, right, this person just killed 52 Muslims. I am going to kill, I'm going to go carry out a terrorist attack in any sort of Britain and France and whatever. And it's these people that we're looking at. We're not looking at the Anwar Awlakis, the Muhammad al-Jolanis, all the dead Abu Bakr al-Baghdadis and Osama bin Ladens. We're looking at the people, the quietists that don't actually want to go and fight. We think that the guys that are on the ground fighting, I think the world's intelligence agencies, all the mukhabarat in the Middle East, and the world's militaries, I think they have a pretty good grasp on where they are and how they're operating. And they're after them with their military hardware, with their intelligence assets, their human intelligence, their signals intelligence, etc. What we want to do is we want to give an idea of the preachers, the people that are, we've got hard evidence on these people. So if these people were to come and say, right, how can you call it extremist? We've got that evidence online. You have said this, you have tweeted that. As we showed on the presentation, you have said this at a rally or a sermon in a mosque. That is all hard evidence that we have against you. And so you can't escape from that. What you've done, however, during your sermon, let's say you've got 200 people during your Friday sermon. 2 or 3 of them, what you said might resonate with 2 or 3 of them. That can then, from there, lead to other things. The world changes every single day. Everything happens at the same time. There could be an attack there, an attack here, etc., etc. Who knows? Who knows? The attack yesterday in Norway with the bows and arrows, it could have just been a white supremacist on another attack, roughly a decade after the Anders Breivik attack. That could then lead to, everything's sort of interconnected. Everything leads to the way people think, the way people start thinking about everything. But Ed, I'd like to invite you to address.
I'm conscious it's 2 p.m. and I'm conscious it's Frank. I don't want to take up too much of your time, Frank, other than to say the following, that on the other side, on the enemy side, they have thousands of organizations. If we can marshal the strength of several hundred of the kind of organizations you've named, then we are stronger, better, and more secure. And I think the distinct thing about EMAN, to my mind, in addition to all the other important organizations you named, from Henry Jackson onwards, is that EMAN brings evidence to the table. EMAN is Muslim-led, and EMAN comes to us from the Middle East. And thus far, we've focused, I think, internally on our own countries and nations. And that's something we ought to applaud. And may there be more, and may there be merrier, and may there be more effective. But thank you for your question. And thank you, by the way, for the sterling work that you do on a daily basis, a nightly basis, Frank.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm conscious it's 2 p.m. and many of you probably have other commitments, but we can probably have time for one last question, if that's fine. I know the gentleman at the back has been wanting to ask a question for a while, so... And please, everyone, if you're free afterwards to stick around, we can have some further discussions.
Yeah, thank you. Osama Hassan from the Tony Blair Institute. Thank you, Frank, for the plug. And somebody who's actually honoured to work with both Professor Ed and Julia at Quilliam over the last 13 years. So, firstly, congratulations. Brilliant work, brilliant presentations. My point is related to something one of the other questioners asked, I think. Because I'm in the Extremism Policy Unit, and my question is that there's a danger of this becoming us versus them, because a lot of the extremists that we're talking about are actually British or European citizens, whether we like it or not. They are part of the British and Western nations. And I think Julia was getting at this with the continuum, because if you focus on extremism, as our Christian friend would say, love the sinner, hate the sin. The problem with extremism. And secondly, because of that continuum that Julia mentioned, people do change. Professor Ed, as he eloquently described in his book, The Islamists, 15 years ago, was an extremist, Hizb ut-Tahrir, and pro the caliphate against all of the direct opposite of what you said now, which was brilliant. And as you know, so was I. I was part of the Salafi continuum of ideas, and I fought in Afghanistan as well, like you, Tom. Great to see you, but that was 30 years ago, different war. So my concern is that just very quickly, Caliph Ali, Sayyidina Ali, Imam Ali said, and he fought the first violent extremists in Islam. But he said they are our brothers who rebelled against us. That remained it, and he fought them. And relating to that, you see, I like the military language. Ed, you've talked about the military language, Clausewitz, etc. Tom, you know all about it. I always felt in the fight against extremism that more people needed to use kind of military language, because this is a war of ideas, rally the troops and know your tactics, strategy, etc. But if we're declaring war like this, which I'm sympathetic to understand, I think we have to be very kind of strategic about it and learn from the military, because this is, if you like, a civil war of ideas. Because, as I said, and we've seen over the last 20 years, tens of thousands of terrorists, both from the Islamist side and the far right and others, are actually part of our own Westphalian nation. I'd love your thoughts on that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I'd like just to begin, exactly what Ed said, something very interesting about von Clausewitz in his book on war. He attacked the center of gravity. When Daesh fell in 2014, Mosul was basically the biggest turning point, right? What is the center of gravity for what we're fighting, right? It's what's in here. It's the ideology. As Nick said during his speech, it's the us versus them, but it's how do we change the lives of the us versus them? It's all of us are one side, and I think the extremists are, and all of us here are from different backgrounds. In this room, we've got Muslims, Christians, Jews, atheists, sorry if I've missed any other religions or any other. We've got everyone in this room, and we all think alike. And what we're fighting against are people that follow our same religion. So other Muslims, other Christians, other Jews, other whatever. But they all, some of the extremists, they all think the same way. The tactics, actually, there was a report that was released recently. The tactics and the strategies of far-right organizations, armed organizations in the US, they have openly glorified the tactics of the Taliban and of Daesh, ISIS. This is the us versus them. It is not Team Islam against Team Christianity. There's no such thing. It is all the elements within one particular religion or ideology against the tiny extremist elements of that same ideology and religion. And this is what we're fighting. And what's frustrating is how can a tiny number of people across the world from different ideologies and different religions, how can it overwhelmingly have or sort of hold the narrative against the rest of everyone else, really? Because I guess, that's what they do every single day. The vast majority of us, we go to work, we come back, we, try to live life, pay our mortgages, look after our kids, etc. But for them, their 24 hours is to divide, is to create, is to foster intolerance, is to create divisions, hatreds, and calling for deaths of other people. Anyone else look?
Last word maybe to Tom.
Well, look, thank you very much. I agree with you that focusing on what the real challenge is and addressing it in languages that are clear and understandable is the challenge. And I think your point about a civil war is, on one level, correct. The reason I wouldn't personally use that language is because it overestimates the size of the enemy. I come back to the point I made when I was standing, which is the real challenge to us today is not that the enemy is strong, but that we're choosing not to fight. It's the Afghan problem of July. We walked away. And just as we've walked away from too many Western, too many liberal institutions, the various different structures of international cooperation, we are walking away from the belief in ourselves as a free and tolerant society that uses tolerance not as a defensive crouch, but as an inclusive and expansionist idea that includes everyone. So I think you're right, but I do think we need to be careful about portraying this as though we're an equal struggle. It's not, but we need to believe in ourselves if we're going to win.
And on that note, what Tom just said, I think really resonates, really just sort of hit a chord in my head, is that we are choosing not to fight, not that the enemy is strong. And I think that's really what this is all about. And at EMAN, we are hoping to start a fight. So this is what we want to do. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. It's an absolute honor and pleasure to have you all here with us today. We're going to be around afterwards until probably 3 o'clock. So if anyone wants to stay around and, be a pleasure to meet you all. face to face. Thank you very much.